Morning everyone. You'll be pleased to hear this isn't a death by PowerPoint. I think we've all had enough of those over the last sort of 48 hours. So my name's Simon Downing, I'm Head of Commercial at Salisbury NHS Trust. I'm also one of the trustees of Carbon Energy Fund. And what we're going to go through today is just more of a discussion than a presentation really around geothermal energy and the potential that has. I'm going to talk through a couple of case studies we've got in the southwest where we're looking to include on the next round of PSDS, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme grants for geothermal. This follows on from the success that we've had this year, and I think it opened about 2 weeks ago, the NHS's first fully owned and funded solar farm in Wolverhampton. Who knew the sun shone so much in Wolverhampton? But that's delivering about 5.5 meg private wire straight into New Cross Hospital, which has been quite a challenge. Kevin wasn't great before we started looking at the solar farm in Wolverhampton, but we're going under a main road, we're going under a West Coast mainline railway and straight into the hospital site. So the City Council in Wolverhampton had a spare decommissioned landfill site. I'm not doing a lot for the Wolverhampton Tourist Board today, but the landfill site was in the middle of the city. And they've leased that at a very small amount into the NHS for us to be able to put an owned and operated and funded solar farm on. And obviously not every hospital's got that sort of land next door. Our own scheme that we're looking at Salisbury, we're very lucky in Salisbury in that we've got a lot of land, we've got a lot of space, and not that far down in comparative terms, we've got a lot of hot rocks. And one of the schemes that has been run a number of years ago down at Southampton was a trial geothermal energy programme that the council ran there. It wasn't massively successful because they were actually dropping their intake of cold water very close to their outtake of hot, and it didn't get much of a plan. We work as a hospital system across the southwest with Bath and North East Somerset. Bath geothermal energy is not new. Romans discovered it about 2,000 years ago and run it very successfully. What we're looking at in terms of this round of innovation partnerships, and I'll come on to what I mean by that in a minute, is the fact that we can go down to about 2,500–3,000 metres. Of that, we'll go down about 1,250 metres, do a Y-shaped split, go across 3,000 metres each, and then by the time you put your cold water, you'll tell I'm not a geothermal engineer by training, you put your cold water in, it warms up and you bring it back. And we're planning to pull out at about 80 degrees, which obviously for low temperature hot water across the hospital site, we currently run a big CHP which is running about 98% of the time. If we can downsize that, go on to solar for some of the other electrical backup as well, that's going to be a big contribution on net zero journey with us, hopefully funded through grants. And that's part of 7 hospitals across the southwest we're looking at running this with. We have the luxury at Salisbury, and it really does help, that we're about to embark on a very large redevelopment scheme on about 7 hectares of the site, similar at Swindon. So we've got that greenfield site to be able to create the geothermal boreholes and then build on top of them afterwards. So we're not trying to retrofit into a particularly difficult area. How are we doing it? Well, in partnership with Carbon Energy Fund, we're running what we call an innovation partnership procurement. If you say to your procurement people, geothermal energy, they'll all look at you and go, no thanks. So what an innovation partnership allows you to do is to work flexibly within the procurement regs to develop that output specification with your supplier, because we don't know as commissioners what the best output's going to be. We almost want to be saying to organisations, actually here's the problem, come to us with a solution. And the innovation partnership is sufficiently flexible to allow us to do that. Stephen and the technical team at CEF obviously have a huge amount of input into actually what the site needs to look like in terms of load, etc. But it's that geothermal energy then that we're looking at being able to bring out, and it gives us, who knows, if I knew what markets were going to be doing in energy, I'd be back trading as I was 15 years ago, and I'd be probably dialing in here from a rather warm island in the Caribbean somewhere, rather than being imagined. The gut feel is across all energy markets that the price is only going to increase at the minute. We've seen what's happened on Nord Stream pipe over the last couple of weeks. That a year ago, if you would have written that as a scenario, they would have given you a really good contract for a nice fictional book, but not actually something that was going to play out in real time. So we've got to start looking at these alternative sources of energy around us. Geothermal doesn't work everywhere. What's the optimal rock, Stephen, for geothermal, would you say? Is that... Even better. So obviously we're not all in the same area. East of England, I guess, would have more of a challenge. Yeah, in terms of their substrates and soils, etc. As you move down into Cornwall, and there's a project the Royal Cornwall Hospitals are looking at around geothermal as well, they have a much shallower requirement to be able to go down to pull out hot water, as some of the mines down there are already demonstrating. So it's not going to be the solution for everybody. Not everyone is going to have the space to do it. If you're the Royal Free or Guys, if you're Guys, I'm guessing the House of Commons are going to object if you start drilling a borehole under them, although it might be the best use of hot air that's ever come out of that building. But it's not going to be for everybody. But certainly where you have a high low temperature hot water demand, as hospitals do, it's something certainly worth looking at. PSDS is a scheme, Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, run by Salix and Cabinet Office, who we work with very closely. We are hoping there's going to be another iteration of it this year. That's not a commitment or a promise, so don't tweet out, Simon said there's going to be PSDS 4. But if the government is serious about the net zero journey, and all the noise coming out of BEIS is that they are still serious about continuing that, it's going to have to be done and funded in that sort of way. So I was going to wrap today really just as a quick Q&A in terms of anyone else that's thinking on that journey. Happy to take questions now, or if we want to look and see what happens over the next 6 months, obviously we'll be keeping you updated. We'll have a site on the CEF website about progress on these schemes and how we can possibly help other organisations as well. I've either stunned everybody into silence, or they're going, what is this bloke on about?
So did you say you were looking for, it's predicated on getting PSDS 4 from them?
Not necessarily. David Mackey, David over there, is the money man for CEF. He will find all sorts of things down the back of a sofa, used lollipops, old fivers, a couple of £1 million, this sort of thing. PSDS is a good route. But obviously with the way that the Treasury are changing Green Book at the moment in terms of how NHS organisations account for potentially third-party loans on their books or owned operated sites, there may be an entire own operated funded model where actually the trust is just paying for the output. The more money you can get free to start off with, the better. is always good.
There's another big funding stream through the Green Heat Network Fund.
Okay.
So the government opened that up in May. And it's running on a 3-monthly cycle all the way through to first quarter 25.
Yum.
So that's very similar sort of.
Yeah. And I think the lesson with all these funding streams is, there's so many out there. Money, even on the money markets at the moment, with the way interest rates are going, is still cheap to what it was years ago. I remember my first mortgage, thanks to John Major, went up to 22.5% overnight, which was a fairly scary bit. Luckily, it was only overnight. But we're still looking at quite cheap money in terms of cost of borrowing. So it's how that's accounted for and the return that can be put in on that. But when you look at the long-term return of some of these schemes, and you look at the long-term market trends that we've seen over the past 2 years and we're going to see going forward, they're only going to become more and more viable, in my humble view anyway.
Yeah, as you said, Sam, there is other methods of finance, market mathematics and stuff. There's really funded operated hospitals, just taking risk to be done by the provider. There's also, at least in the case of funders, there's over 100 million for these type of projects, provided there's a sort of security level, the hospital guarantees by the heat. There's also accommodates centralized Mines Alexander, the UK investment director for the extent. We've done stuff with them in the past, it's 330 million, which was announced last year, which went from instant into basically pre-instant, because it's funny there with this fits within the parameters. So there is capital available for these sources, until if there's a viable project or a viable optic, flex it in certain different ways.
I think it's worth mentioning that one of the strengths of the way CEF structure contracts with suppliers as well is, David mentioned, risk. That risk sits with the provider, with the supplier, to keep the scheme running. So actually, even if the scheme failed, for example, and wasn't delivering the hot water that it thought it would be, because the way the contracts are structured around the guaranteed savings payments to the trust, and we've seen it in other forms of energy as well, actually the trust is still getting that balance sheet benefit regardless, and the risk needs to sit with the suppliers operating it, because they know the market. And it allows as well, over maybe a 20-year scheme, for 2 or 3 technological upgrades, because who knows where that tech will be in 5-6 years time, and we want to have that refresh ability within the contracts to make sure that we're getting the absolute maximum out of all the time.
Yeah, 'cause you can just do a couple and wrap them up into one funding stream. Somebody comes in, buy them independent operating, so moves it up another level of funding. So they could buy out maybe 25 up, 4 or 5 another million, and then buy it, reduce the debt level, and then you see if it can back to the hospital. That's different ways of playing it.
I think it's coming back to that ambition, isn't it? And NHS and organisations have traditionally been quite risk averse in the way that we've previously looked at how we generate our energy. I still talk to trusts now who say, "Oh, it's really good. We're thinking of putting in a more efficient CHP." Really? And that discussion is still ongoing. So it's how we can look at all the alternative forms of energy that we have out there and start really bringing them in for the benefits of both the communities, district heating networks as well. The hospital doesn't have to be the only site. And as part of the site, particularly at Salisbury, we have around 400 staff accommodation units. We have potentially new university campus that we're building alongside the hospital site. All of that will be able to be fed off the same network, so it's really widening that benefit to as many people as possible. Either everyone's decided it's lunchtime or we've come to a natural lull. But if you need to know any more about sort of geothermal, please do pick up with any of the CEF team or myself. They know far more about the structuring than me. Sorry? For geothermal, well, we're about to go out to procure for 7. So that's 7 pilot sites, and that's including Salisbury, Bath, Swindon, I think down into Somerset as well, aren't we, in that tranche. Preston, which is clearly not in the south, but even my limited geography works out that Preston is not in the southwest. So again, it's those trial sites, and if you've got sites, an interest that you would have involved in being part of that, please do let us know, and we can see where we can go with that as well. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and do chat up with the rest of the sort of CEF team about anything to do with that. Thank you.